My name is Ryan Gray. I work for Merkle Science. I was in law enforcement for about 7 years before this. Um, I'm not as experienced with crypto, but I've been working at Merkle for a little while now, and we have some experts in the crypto space. And I'll go ahead and start with introductions of Richard Reinhardt.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Richard Reinhardt. I'm lead investigator at Merkle Science. Joined Merkle in November of last year. Prior to that, I was a special agent with IRS criminal investigation out of the New York field office, where I was the supervisor for the cyber investigations unit. And prior to that, I've been working in cyber investigations since 2015.
Great. We also have Matthew here, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Matthew Swenson. I am currently the Chief Executive Officer for North America for Black Rainbow Group. We are a investigation intelligence case management platform. And prior to that, I was also a special agent. I worked for Homeland Security Investigations. Also on the cyber side, I was the division chief at the DHS Cybercrime Center in the Washington, D.C. area. And crypto support, analytics, and licensing all fell underneath one of my teams that I supervised. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thank you for those introductions. This webinar is going to be sponsored by Merkle Science. It's the leading challenger in the crypto forensic space, and you're going to be able to see some of the investigations that we can do when we start talking about bridges later. So I just want to go ahead and get started. What are some engaging patterns you see in emerging patterns you see in crypto crime? And I'll start with Richard.
I think the complicated methods, I guess you could say, that bad actors are using, they're always getting more and more sophisticated with the way they're moving illicit crypto proceeds, whether it's from a romance scam, a hack, an exploit of a bridge or a service. Instead of go back 5-10 years ago, you had just Bitcoin. Now you have a variety of different tokens and a variety of different ways you could swap those tokens, move those tokens on different chains. So I think the challenge for law enforcement is keeping pace with the different changes that are going on in the crypto arena.
Great. Matthew, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think in the early stages when we first encountered cryptocurrency being used illicitly, really, if you think back to Silk Road was really when we first encountered it, doing a dark web marketplace transactions. The bad actors or criminal actors that were utilizing it assumed that all the transactions were anonymous. And so there wasn't much of an attempt by them to obfuscate their transactions. Once they realized that those transactions could be traced and utilized for attribution, which honestly is one of the, following the money is one of the most powerful tools to conduct attribution when you don't know, because they're hiding behind some sort of anonymous profile. Once they figured out that there was a whole world of tracing that was growing, and the tools were getting more and more sophisticated, and law enforcement was getting better and better at it. They started using various techniques, like Richard pointed out, to obfuscate their transactions and make it much more difficult than it was previously in order to figure out who was behind those types of transactions. If you look at kind of the world of fiat-based money laundering, the techniques haven't changed all that much. We see drug cartels and whatnot kind of laundering money through financial institutions, kind of in the same way that they've always done, going all the way back into the 80s. Whereas cryptocurrency based money laundering is very, very dynamic, very fast paced, changing. They're looking at the means in which law enforcement is tracing those transactions and finding new techniques in order to hide the attribution behind the transactions. So you really need to stay ahead and stay up to speed on all those technological changes, much more so than kind of traditional financial investigations.
It's kind of funny, right? Because in the beginning we were like single focused, right? Bitcoin, darknet markets. Let's see who's selling stuff on the dark web. And then as you evolve to today, you're dealing with NFT rug pulls, you're dealing with token frauds, you're dealing with traditional money laundering now using crypto. And then, like we were talking about earlier, the different ways you can obfuscate your funds through these different services. It's mind-boggling at how quickly everything is moving.
It really is. And, another interesting thing too is how well the bad actors communicate with each other and learn from each other and learn from the mistakes that other bad actors have made, and then change their tactics moving forward. It's almost in real time. And so, whereas the government tends to move very slowly, so it tends to be very problematic, I think, for a lot of investigators and trying to conduct your investigations, and at the same time stay up to speed with all the new stuff that they're seeing in this realm.
I think that sums it up very well. In such a rapidly changing environment, how does law enforcement handle criminal activity on cryptocurrencies as opposed to traditional money laundering and other illicit fund movements? And
That's an interesting one, because going back to what Matt touched on earlier, in traditional money laundering, you had bank accounts, right? You can only move so much at one time through a bank account. There's KYC, so everybody knew to be careful, use a bunch of shell companies or nominees to open the accounts. You add in crypto, it's not, I mean, it's just adding another step in the layering process of the whole money laundering process, but it's made it extremely complicated. But at the end of the day, I don't think anything has changed. It's, we're still at the end of the day looking to where did this money get cashed out, because you can't spend the crypto, right? The bad guy can't buy a house, can't buy a car, can't buy groceries with their crypto. So at the end of the day, for law enforcement, we're trying to get to the exit point, the off ramp of where the crypto went as quickly as possible, so we can get attribution, IP addresses, email addresses, anything to identify the bad actor. I think what's unique is in traditional money laundering, if I'm a drug dealer and I have $1 million, I can't walk to the bank and just put that $1 million in. Red flags are going to go up everywhere. With crypto, you can move large sums of money at one time and nobody knows anything because everything's anonymous, right? Until you get to an exchange or a cash out point. So I think the volume of money that moves in crypto related frauds, scams, whatever you want to refer to it as, it's interesting. But they also have a problem too. When they go to exit or off ramp those funds, it becomes difficult because not many people have the capacity to offload the amount of money that you're seeing stolen on some of these exploits.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to add on to what Richard's saying, I think that it's anytime you add a kind of a technological component to an investigation, it makes it that much more difficult for the investigator to have to keep up, abreast with changes. So, if you look at some of the traditional kind of what you would consider old school investigations, once you get comfortable in that space and you kind of become a subject matter expert, there's not nearly as much new stuff coming in that you have to worry about. Whereas with crypto, you really have to be dedicated to it. I think it's something that you have to look at as a full-time thing. It can't be something that you're going to get very proficient at doing it on a part-time basis. And the dynamic pace in which things occur, if you think about comparing like maybe a ransomware based crypto payment as opposed to a business email compromise via fiat, even business email compromise, which you have to work at a very quick pace, there's still an opportunity to possibly kill that wire transaction because it takes time to, hours and hours and hours, if not days, to process and get through the system. Whereas if Richard and I are engaged in some sort of a fraud scheme where we send that money via crypto, once it's gone, it's gone. There's no opportunity to kind of get in the middle of that and stop it from happening. So because of the nature of that and the dynamic aspect to it, you really have to move quickly and really know what you're doing in order to respond to some of these things.
It's unique too, right? Because go back years ago when you're working an investigation, you're trained and your natural reaction is to not share anything with anybody, right? Everything's held tight to the vest. You don't talk to anybody. And now, like we were touching on earlier, the constant changes in the crypto arena and the different tools and techniques used, you see law enforcement more and more relying on private sector relationships to stay ahead of the curve, because you can't do it on your own, right? There's just not enough employees in any agency to stay on top of how fast this stuff is changing. So it's unique to see these private sector relationships with the government and how big they're getting.
Yeah, it used to be, government and law enforcement, they would label everything law enforcement sensitive, and they were very hesitant to share information. We're slowly getting away from that, but like I said earlier, the government's slow to change. But I know that that's been a concern from a lot of private entities and institutions, organizations, that are like, hey, we really wish law enforcement will be quicker to share information. I think law enforcement's coming around and they're understanding that, hey, we don't have weeks and months to kind of look at this, sanitize it, make sure it's all, okay to share, whatever. They're slowly wrapping their heads around the concept of sharing information in real time, or as close to real time as they can get, because they realize that the nature of these things, it's going to be a requirement. And just putting some trust in the private sector partners and understanding that, hey, we all want to work together to catch these guys and prevent the next big, fraud attack from occurring.
Right. And all the resources being put into different tracing tools. I mean, obviously, if law enforcement had to rely on open source blockchains, it would take forever, even longer than it does now, to crack some of these crypto cases. So the crypto tracing tools, the forensics tools, the compliance tools are extremely helpful to law enforcement as far as cracking these crypto frauds.
Thank you. So what are some of the challenges you face when you trace criminal activity that happens across chains? Are you able to trace funds that go through bridges and swaps?
Matt, you want to start this one? Or?
Yeah, it makes things very difficult. It was a lot easier when all we saw was Bitcoin, in the early days. And moving from chain to chain definitely adds a layer of complexity to it. What is helpful nowadays is that particularly the commercial based platforms, they now understand that that's occurring, and it's a lot easier to trace those transactions than it was. If you look back a couple of years, it was nearly impossible. If we saw somebody move from, say, Bitcoin to Ethereum, it was essentially a dead end. Whereas nowadays, because of the robust support that the platforms have for a variety of different cryptocurrencies, we can see the movement from one chain, from a move from one blockchain to another. And I think this is really where having a commercially available tool at your disposal is really going to prove integral, because otherwise trying to do this in an open source capacity using freely available tools is going to be impossible. And a variety of other reasons. I think the commercial tools are very powerful, but this is one where it's an absolute must-have. If you don't have something, like a Merkle Science tracker at your disposal, you're going to hit a dead end.
Yeah, I agree. And like you can see from the display here, so to answer your question, can commercial tools trace through these bridges? The answer is yes and no. I don't know of anybody that has the ability to trace every bridge that's out there, but like with everything we said earlier, the speed at which the changes happen in this arena, everybody's catching up. So like what we have on the screen here is an illustration of the Merkle Science tracker tool and how we can visually show you a transaction through a bridge. So if you look over on the left, you'll see the wallet transferred out funds that were on the Optimism network from Ether and USDC. and then those funds were transferred onto the Ethereum network. And then on the bottom example, you have the arbitrage bridge and the same transaction happening. So you could see the funds going in and out, the ones that were swapped, how much were swapped. And then if this was live on these little bridges here, you would see what bridge was used to execute that transaction. So yes, you can. Not every bridge out there, but yes, you have the ability to. And again, that's to the credit of the commercial tools that are out there. I don't know that.
No,
Go ahead,
sorry
Matt.
to interrupt, Richard. I was just going to add too that the ability to visualize this, I think, is very helpful. And then explaining it, for us, is that it's not enough to kind of understand it within our world of experts that see this on a regular basis. A lot of times then you're going to have to explain it to somebody. In the law enforcement world, you're going to have to explain it to a prosecutor, right? And say, hey, this is what's going on. The visual representation really makes that a lot easier. On the private sector side, you may have to explain it to somebody else in a compliance department or up the chain into the executive suite or whatever. And the ability to be able to show this all visually on a graph is very helpful when you're breaking down the transaction from point A all the way through to point B and where it finally ends up. I think this is one of the most useful parts of a commercially available platform.
I agree. So I think we've already touched on this, but is there anything to add to how are you effectively navigating some of these challenges? And you can start, Matt.
Yeah, I think training and taking it upon yourself to just try and stay up to speed with everything going on. Jumping into the platform, don't be scared, trace as many transactions as possible, and just get as comfortable as you can. Again, I don't think you're going to achieve a very high level of proficiency unless you're doing this on a regular basis. That's not something you can kind of jump into once a month or a couple times a month and get really good at it. You just have to keep at it. And then you'll start to identify patterns and movements and things like, chain hopping, moving through bridges and mixers and then, large peel chains and whatnot. It just comes with experience. I've seen some phenomenal analysts out there that are able to see things in a, spaghetti, highly condensed form of transactions everywhere, and they're able to move in and say, hey, this is significant. There's something going on with the movement of money from here to here. And then once they see that, they're able to understand really what's going on and what the key points are. And that just comes, I think, with practice.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you have to use the tools to your advantage too. You can't get lost in the weeds tracing transactions for days, months, even years. At the end of the day, you're looking for attribution on the bad actor. You're not going to put cuffs on a digital wallet, right? So you're using the tool to get to the quickest exit point that you can to get attribution on the bad actor, whether it's IP addresses, email addresses, whatever was used that you can use to identify that bad actor, because our tools are going to show you what you need to know as far as the on-chain activity. But at the end of the day, the goal for the investigator is to identify where the funds came out and who the bad actor behind the activity is.
Speaking about getting data on the criminals, how do you get in touch with virtual asset service providers and request their data? Richard?
I mean, most agencies have a database of, VASPs or banks that they're going to need subpoena compliance from. Tools, the commercial tools, some of them, Merkle being one of them, has a directory of different VASPs that you might need to contact as part of your investigation. And then you would issue them a subpoena for records, just like you would a traditional bank. And hopefully those records come back and, they're, some exchanges are better than others on what they provide you. Some will just give you limited information, and others are good and they just give you every single piece of information they have. So that's going to depend on what exchange you're dealing with or with what bank you're dealing with.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's, you know, from the law enforcement perspective, is keeping in close contact with the trust and safety teams at the various exchanges and knowing who they are. They do, you know, they were getting very good at, or they are getting very good at doing proactive things. So, you know, we would work like a lot of child exploitation related investigations, which are no brainers for them. They immediately see transactions coming in from known child exploitation sites. They immediately turn around and identify law enforcement right away. They don't wait for us to send a subpoena or some sort of legal paperwork in. Whereas that was not the case, you know, 5-10 years ago. So I think the exchanges and the VASPs are doing a much better job of being proactive, and it's just building relationships with them, knowing who to reach out to, so that when you're working an investigation and something pings at Coinbase or Binance or whoever it may be, you know, hey, I want to send this in. I want to make sure they know specifically what I'm asking for. And if I need to clarify something, I actually have a physical person I can reach out to instead of just a generic email box that I'm sending my paperwork into. That can kind of help gear you so you can specify that paperwork for records that they know that they're going to have, and that will help you, you know, in your investigation. I think that's.
I think it's unique too, though, in the DeFi space. Obviously, the whole point of crypto in the beginning, right, was the anonymity behind it, right? So a lot of these services are behind on what kind of records they're going to provide to you, if any at all. I think that's a unique thing to the, you know, the crypto space. Banks, the regulations are, you know, pretty big, and there's a lot of rules they have to follow, whereas the exchanges, US based, obviously they have to follow the same rules. But once you get out of the US, depending on where you are, there's a lot of these exchanges and service providers in countries with little or no regulatory guidelines to follow. So you're not going to get anything.
That's a great point, Richard. There, you think of the banks as they're almost very similar to the government with the levels of compliance and regulation and whatnot. Very careful, very methodical. A lot of the exchanges and VASPs are more like tech companies, you know, where they're used to moving very quick, operating very quick, at kind of the tech edge of things, and not necessarily as compliance focused. And so, and particularly outside of the US tends to be kind of leading the crypto space in terms of regulations and compliance and whatnot. Once you leave that, it can be the Wild West out there, and it proves to be very difficult.
Thank you. So, can investigators rely only on data from a tracing tool when they prosecute a criminal, or do you use other tools as well?
You definitely cannot just rely on the tracing tool. I think we touched on that earlier. Again, the commercial tools available are there to bring you to an exit ramp to find, again, where's this money going and how is it going to be spent? Because again, you can't spend crypto, right? We can't buy houses, we can't buy luxury items with it. So they have to cash it out. So again, that's what you're trying to get to, is where is it being off-ramped? And is that off-ramp going to be a compliant exchange? There's a lot of peer-to-peer networks out there that you're never going to get visibility into. You know, you can go on Telegram or any other communication platform. You could find somebody that's willing to exchange your crypto for you. Now, you're not gonna be able to do it in millions and, you know, a couple of millions of dollars worth, but you're gonna be able to cash out small amounts at a time that will never touch an exchange. That's gonna be between you and another person. So that's always gonna be a black hole. And again, like we said, the exchanges, some are gonna give you compliance and some are not. So it's always evolving.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree 100%. I think that Richard's dead on. There's going to be an exit point somewhere, and that's kind of what you're hoping, is that eventually, you know, all the tracing tools are basically telling you is the move of money from wallet to wallet to wallet. You're going to have to get out into the physical world, into the real world, to really do attribution, and a tracing tool is never going to get you all the way there. you're going to have to use other open source or commercially available intelligence products to, I think, get that true level of attribution with a certain level of confidence. And then, you know, even with the tracing tools, I think validating, verifying, you know, as much of that information as you can to get as certain as you can, I think is the right path that people want to take.
Right. And any good agent, investigator, cop is using a combination of tools. So like you're taking your information that you get from one VASP and you're just, or bank, and you're continually building off that information. So you get an email from bank A, you're going to run that email through a number of other databases to see if that email is being used for something else. IP addresses, obviously most of these people are using VPNs, but if you are clever enough, you can find a point where that VPN went off and you're going to get their actual IP address. You're constantly looking for holes like that. So you're going to use a number of open source tools, private sector tools to continue to build your case. Again, the crypto tracing tool is going to get you to leads, but it's not going to solve your case.
Yeah, and particularly in the law enforcement world, the attribution has to be, you know, it can't be a nice to have, like, hey, you know, we know that this group in Russia is, you know, this ransomware group is responsible because we traced, you know, the Bitcoin from here to here. In law enforcement, you have to indict humans, individual people, and you have to be certain of that. So it's a little bit different standard, and law enforcement's a little bit unique in that we actually care down to the actual individual behind the keyboard, whereas maybe a lot of organizations don't really care to that extent. But when you're dealing with that, you really want to make sure that your attribution is dead on. I've seen cases where we were pretty certain that we thought it was somebody, and lo and behold, you know, we get a new piece of information. We're like, wow, this person we were deadlocked on, that we were almost certain was the person behind this, it turns out to be somebody else. And, you know, I think it's good if you have the results from any automated tool, whether it be in the crypto tracing space, you know, on the digital forensic side, the cyber side, or whatever, the cyber threat intelligence side. If you can verify those results with another tool, it gives you peace of mind to say, hey, I trust this tool. I know it's pretty accurate, but now I've confirmed the exact same level of tracing, analytics, attribution with another tool. It just reinforces that. And I think, at least, you know, from my perspective, it helps you sleep a little bit easier knowing that, hey, I'm not 100% reliant on one certain thing.
Well, and at the end of the day too, right, you always need, in any prosecution, you're going to need source records. And that's what the tool is bringing you to. So again, we talk about off ramps. You want the bank records that support, you know, any money that you are able to identify moving in fiat. Even for, you know, we could say, you know, bad actor has wallet A. The next question is going to be, well, how do you know that? Okay, well, we trace that wallet to using this IP address. We service this IP service provider. This IP service provider gave us these records and says it's him. Those records came back to this address. We go back to that address. That address comes back to this same guy, blah, blah, blah. And you just got to keep building, but you have to have your third-party source records to support whatever claims you're going to make in a criminal prosecution. The tool will visually help you explain it to people, like Matt said earlier. You're going to be explaining it to, you know, a group of jurors who probably don't understand crypto. Maybe one or two of them will. Judge probably doesn't understand it, and then half of your prosecutors don't understand it. So the tool is a great way to visually dumb down a very complex transaction and say funds went from here, they were moved through here, they came out of here, and then they were exited, and here's how this guy got his money.
I agree. I think attribution is really important, especially as more prosecutors get involved. Different states have different requirements on how much attribution they need. Being able to easily get it is a hugely important process. So could you tell us the process for how assets are actually seized from a criminal, Richard? Just expand upon it.
Well, if you are fortunate enough to find funds sitting in a wallet or at an exchange, you would then have to get legal service from the court to seize those funds. Whether you're going to do it criminally, you can seize it criminally, you can seize it civilly, but it's going to take court documents Just like if you had an arrest warrant for a person, it's going to be very similar. You're going to have evidence to support why you're going to grab those funds. And then those funds will be locked into a secure wallet, transfer from the bad actor wallet to a secure wallet that has very limited access until the legal process takes its course.
Thank you, Richard. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
And I was just, that's exactly right. And I would say, we always try to have our agents and analysts ready ahead of time. If we were going to do some sort of law enforcement operation criminally, usually not so much on the civil side, the civil side is much more planned out. We kind of know way in advance that, hey, we're going to civilly go after this amount of money or whatever. But a lot of times we would go out and do enforcement activities, search warrants and whatnot, where we thought, hey, there's a good chance we may seize cryptocurrency, but we're not entirely sure that it's going to be there, was to err on the side of caution and make sure that the investigators who are working that case are prepared and they know what they're doing. You would get people who aren't necessarily in full-time cryptocurrency groups, but maybe working narcotics or something. And now they've encountered something that's a little out of their wheelhouse, where they have somebody who's selling fentanyl or something else, but who's also involved in dark web marketplaces and they're known to move cryptocurrency, is getting them prepared, saying, hey, here's the process, here's our agency procedures, make sure you have a government controlled laptop or hardware wallet at your disposal that has limited control to make sure we can establish chain of custody and all these types of things. And so that we're not scrambling at the last minute and say, oh my God, look, we were doing a forensic preview on this person's laptop and we found, a bunch of wallets and a bunch of crypto sitting here and we don't know what to do. As much of that as you can plan ahead of time, the better, so that you're ready to go.
Yeah, it's interesting because even like, depending on who you're working with, on a lot of times before you even go into a place, you're like conducting a crash course real quick on what crypto is, what a wallet looks like, what a seed phrase is, just so those inexperienced people know what they're looking for. It's funny, like the newer agents that you caught coming in today, a lot of them seem to be crypto savvy, or they could wrap their head around it at least compared to like older agents. But then a lot of times the younger agents want to stay with the digital side of things. And like you said before, Matt, they don't want to get away from their desk. I think you see like 50-50 of that. I know I had a agent working for me at the end. The kid was awesome at everything, tracing, law enforcement work. He understood and he could wrap his head around everything. And that's what you're looking for today, is these younger agents that can wrap their heads around this stuff and understand how to be a cop.
Yeah, agreed. I was working in our Los Angeles field office, and I became the crypto forensic person that was on call. And I remember one time we were working at it was an ecstasy controlled delivery. So somebody ordered ecstasy to a post office box. They came, picked it up, and we followed them home, and then did a search warrant at the house. The house was way south in Orange County. I was in the northern end of LA, and they're calling me saying, hey, we just went in, we served an anticipatory search warrant at this house, and can you get down here? And anybody that's lived in Los Angeles knows, like, hey, from one end of LA to the other is like 2 hours. And so I'm driving 2 hours, and they're trying to tell me what they're seeing on the screen. And as much of that as you can avoid and be ready to go, the better.
100%.
Definitely. So could you each tell us about one interesting case you've worked in cryptocurrency? And we can go ahead and start with Richard on this one.
Most interesting, I guess for me, would be I did a lot of undercover work. So meeting with peer-to-peer exchangers and buying crypto for cash or cash for crypto, vice versa, was always a unique experience. You never know who you're going to meet. You never know how they're going to react. And I think that is another unique thing with crypto, is there's a lot of covert activity that has to happen on the law enforcement side, again, trying to put a face to a wallet. And again, like we were talking before, the tool can bring you so far. And if you do an undercover with, a peer-to-peer exchanger who's laundering funds for you, they're never going to be able to argue that the tool is wrong, right? You told me to send it to this wallet. This is your wallet. And then we use our tool to identify these other wallets. And then we follow that money forward to where you cashed it out. So there's no arguing the facts there, right? So it was always fun just going around and seeing the different cast of characters that you would meet doing it.
That's definitely an interesting one. Matt, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I one of the interesting ones I worked on was an Operation Dark Gold, which was worked by HSI New York, and also in conjunction with Secret Service. I had actually left Homeland Security at the time, and I had worked over at NASA at the NASA Inspector General office. I was leading the cybercrime team for the Western U.S. And we identified this scientist who was working at the Johnson Space Center, which fell under me. He was moving large amounts of money, we could see. And he had an outside work authorization to do work on the side. And we noticed on his government computer at NASA, he was checking his bank account, and he was moving hundreds of thousands of dollars in and out. I think he had, more than $700,000. And we couldn't figure out what he was doing. But, he had all these suspicious activity reports filed from the banks. And we knew it was something probably illicit. And we started monitoring his computer because it was a government computer, no reasonable expectation of privacy during the work hours. And sure enough, I'm like, this is something big. I don't know what it is, but it's going to be something big. And lo and behold, the guy, he was operating as a NASA scientist during the day. And then at night in his off hours, he was the largest Bitcoin cash out vendor around. So he had been around since the Silk Road days. He had transitioned to Alpha Bay and some of the other, markets that came about when Silk Road was taken down. And what he would do is people would send him Bitcoin, and then he would send them US currency, fiat currency in the mail via FedEx. So he would label it, he would vacuum seal it, get it real thin, and then label it legal documents and send it out. And he had very few packages seized. He was on time. He was meticulous. And what was interesting in that case was eventually HSI New York and Secret Service started working on it. This is way bigger than anything that we're capable of working at NASA OIG. And it was a very early transaction that he had made at Coinbase early on that we were able to do attribution on. So that's another interesting point, is that a lot of times these actors they're very technical and they're very good on the cyber side of things, but they're not expert money launderers. That comes with time and with practice. And when they make mistakes, oftentimes it's very early on. But obviously these records are historical, right? Once you put something onto the blockchain, it never leaves. So if you make one mistake from an email address or an account that you registered on an exchange with your real life identity, a lot of times they forget about that, and it ends up haunting them 5, 6, 7 years later. So that's what happened in this case. HSI ended up taking over that account in undercover capacity and actually running that gold account for more than a year, where people were sending us cryptocurrency. We were using it to figure out who they were and do the attribution back to them, and then sending them US money, fiat currency back. And because of that, we were able to identify people selling guns, drugs, you name it, and ended up doing, I think, more than 40, 50 search warrants and arresting a lot of high profile targets. When those marketplaces were taken and seized and knocked down, Hansa, Alphabet, or whatnot, we're like, all right, this has run its course, and we eventually shut it down. But really a fascinating case. If anybody's listening, they can Google Operation Dark Gold, and there's a lot of information about it.
I think also too, when you're talking about crypto and crime, it's important to pay attention to those crimes that happen off chain, right? I remember back in 2015 when I was thrown into crypto, nobody in law enforcement knew much. Like, we knew Silk Road, we knew there was this Bitcoin thing out there. Nobody understood the blockchain or anything like that. And my first case was actually a crypto Ponzi scheme called OneCoin, which I literally found that, searching through emails and saw an advertisement for it. And we teamed up with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we just built that case from a couple junk emails to a $5 billion international fraud. And the reason I bring that up is with like the recent SEC approvals, right? In addition to on-chain fraud, I'm sure there's bad actors that are going to be looking for wallets that are holding these Bitcoins, but there's also going to be bad actors out there creating new frauds around these spot ETFs, right? And they're going to try and find a way to scam people. So like for the compliance people out there, there's on-chain fraud, but there's also a ton of off-chain fraud related around different currencies and projects that probably bring in as much, if not more, in fraud proceeds. So it's an interesting area.
Thank you, Matt. That's a super interesting case. I really appreciate that. Also, you too, Richard. We're almost finished with a lot of our questions, but we have a lot of attendee questions, so I'm just going to ask some of those right now. Can you explain what you mean by off-chain? Is one of the questions we have.
When I was just referring to off-chain, like traditional financial frauds, right? Like the OneCoin case, like Matt said, if you want to go online and look it up, there's good podcasts about it. There's cryptocurrency fraud and then crypto related fraud, right? So crypto related fraud are scams around the crypto ecosystem where people see an opportunity to bring in investments. I'll just use the OneCoin scam. They advertised that they had the next Bitcoin killer, right? And it was going to be the next big token. You're not really buying a token. You had to invest fiat currency, traditional currency, in order to buy into this. Those funds were just stolen and laundered through different bank accounts. So there's no on-chain activity that you can look at on the blockchain and see this fraud. It's just a traditional scam executed around blockchain technology, but off-chain.
And to Richard's point too, a lot of these actors, they have to have a means to launder the fiat. Once they cash out, now you've got like essentially millions of dollars. It can't just randomly show up in your bank account. They then have to develop an off-chain method for laundering that money once they get it into fiat. So it ends up to be very, very complex. And a lot of it, they're trying to figure out how to do it because, like I said, nobody's born an expert money launderer. And it's not like these guys are growing up in drug cartels where they've been doing this for decades. A lot of times they're acting all by themselves or in small groups, and they're trying to figure out how to do it. So they can make a lot of mistakes until they get that process down. And a lot of those mistakes are what lead to their attribution, is the off-chain part of it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Richard. Another question we have here is, can you explain how hot wallets work? For example, the use of an exchange's hot wallet address to send funds to a terrorist financing address. How can we attribute that to one person when multiple persons may use that address?
As far as I know, you can't attribute it to one person. You'd have to get records from the exchange, and hopefully they can identify the person who accessed that hot wallet where the funds went out to.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I agree. I mean, it's very difficult, but hopefully there's some sort of IP history on who's accessing it, from a specific IP address that may enable you to narrow it down, or at least see a pool of people who are logging in remotely. But that can be very problematic.
And that's going to be dependent again on what exchange it went through. Is it a KYC compliant exchange, or is it one of these exchanges that we were talking about before that are in a country with very lax regulations? And then, you got the less than 50% chance of getting any attribution out of that.
I think that leads me into the next question somebody asked. Can you speak to the process and unique challenges of U.S. law enforcement requesting records of subpoenaing information from exchanges based outside of the U.S.? How do investigators handle the often global scale of these investigations?
It's extremely problematic. We have a process called the MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, with most countries. And it kind of establishes a process for submitting an MLAT request in. It goes to the government, comes through our government, over theirs and down. And by the time, it gets to the person who may actually be able to fulfill that request, it can take months, a lot of times. And so I think that's where these global groups of law enforcement people, whether it be Interpol, Europol, all these working groups that are focused specifically on crypto, help, because then you can reach directly out and say, hey, I have something that's time sensitive. Do you have contacts at this exchange where you could pull this information, get it to me? I'll follow up with an MLAT so that we can get it officially to be able to use it in court. But in the interim, can you go through your unofficial channels to get something back so I know, hey, am I going in the right direction? I don't want my investigation to completely stall out because, like I said before, they're time sensitive. That's where these types of, other law enforcement relationships, private sector relationships all come into play so that you can get that information quickly and not have to wait for, these lengthy official channels to kind of come together.
Thank you. That actually leads me into another question I have. How does collaboration among law enforcement and industry experts improve investigations, effectiveness, and recovery?
I think, like we talked about earlier, that's a necessary evil, especially when you're talking with crypto. One, obviously, the tools are extremely helpful in mapping out the transactions quicker than you could just by viewing public ledgers. But two, an agent could be working a case for a year, sometimes even longer, maybe 2 or 3 cases at a time. By the time those are done, like we talked about earlier, the crypto space changes so quickly that agent doesn't have a time to sit and do his work as well as stay up to date on the changes in the crypto space. So you're relying on companies like Merkle and others out there to stay up to date on the different changes in the crypto arena. So when that agent does finish those 2 or 3 cases and they come back to, just say you started out in 2015, you were a Bitcoin guy, you fast forward to now, you're assigned a new crypto case and there's bridges involved. Well, now that agent can't sit for 6 months and learn about bridges. So you're going to rely on your private sector relationship with whoever you're using to educate you and to help you follow through those transactions that now go through a bridge versus just staying on the Bitcoin blockchain and just following it there. And it's unique, right? Because again, as a law enforcement officer, you're always taught, keep everything tight to your chest, don't tell anybody anything. And now you're relying on these relationships and you're seeing it more and more, even with not even just tracing tools. Like you're seeing a lot of open source companies get involved with government contracts to help speed up these processes because crypto moves so fast.
Yeah, I agree. And we actually have come a long way. There's still a long way to go in terms of deconfliction and working together and everything. Because like Richard said, law enforcement, agencies tend to keep stuff very close to the vest. And that's not just, law enforcement versus private sector. That's also within law enforcement agencies. A lot of times they don't necessarily want to be willing to share amongst other law enforcement agencies. And you look at a case like a Silk Road, IRS, HSI, FBI, we're all working different components and nobody really knew what everybody was doing until finally for the end we kind of bumped into, everybody bumped into each other, but it was more just a chance encounter through, talking to various US attorneys and figuring it out. Whereas today, at least we have like a main deconfliction process that's called a system called DICE, where if I get a wallet and I'm like, hey, this just popped up, I wonder if anybody's working it, you can pop it in there and it'll show, hey, FBI is working on this. Here's the person. You can call them and say, hey, I noticed you have this wallet. You're looking at it. It popped up in my investigation too. Let's share information, see what we have, because maybe I have pieces of the puzzle that you don't and all of that. I think that really helps, bring everybody together because a lot of times you have a different angle that another agency doesn't have or another investigator doesn't have. And it's the quicker you can kind of come together and work together, the better.
And that also goes with the exchanges or the banks that you're going to be subpoenaing records from too, right? Like traditionally banks give you, what they need to give you: name, address, bank account numbers, and the records to go with it. Now, law enforcement is asking for more and more because of crypto. Attribution becomes more and more important. So you see banks providing IP addresses, email addresses. You see the exchanges doing the same thing because it's extremely, like, if you're looking at this from a compliance side, right, you're going to use these forensics tools and these compliance tools to make sure there's no risk to your bank. But once you know there's a risk to your bank and you provide records to a law enforcement agency that contains everything they could possibly ask for, it's extremely helpful when you're working a case to get all that information, which traditionally you just got the bare bone minimum stuff.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Matt. We have a few more questions. If anybody else wants to ask questions as well, I'm going to try and get to as many of them as I can. So the next question is super specific, but we'll see. Did you face any virtual asset or cryptocurrency cases in the Middle East? And if so, were there any specific challenges in that jurisdiction to either of you?
I have not.
Okay.
I know we had a big terrorist financing case that we worked. It was a known terrorist group held up a sign and said, hey, if you want to donate to this wallet. And we were tracing money. It was worked in conjunction. I wasn't working on it specifically. I was supplying support from a headquarters level to it. It was HSI Philadelphia, IRS, and FBI were working on it. I don't remember. I know there's various OFAC issues, Office of Foreign Asset Control, which we have to coordinate with in working a lot of those cases. But I don't remember any specific difficulties that we encountered working in the region offhand.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. Going into our next question. Are state and local agencies seizing and forfeiting crypto a lot, or do they typically lose jurisdictional control to the feds due to the international nature of crypto crimes? For my input, I'm working with a couple agencies that are smaller, even one in Wisconsin now that's doing great work, taking down crypto crime, even across states into California and other agencies. So I do believe that local departments do have a lot of control to, if they're interested in specializing in crypto, they can do some of these seizures in conjunction with law enforcement from federal agencies. But if you two have any input.
I think it, go ahead,
Sorry,
Matt.
go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think it depends on the complexity of the case, right? If it's a typical romance scam, pig butchering scam, involves a citizen of a particular town, getting ripped for 50 to 100 grand. And like you said, the detective or the police officer is capable of tracing those funds to an exchange and seizing them. I think they do that pretty often. But it's when you get to more sophisticated people, again, like if they're coin swapping, using bridges, real sophisticated people don't use one bridge, they use multiple bridges to launder their funds. I would think a department would then reach out to a higher state or federal authority to assist. Doesn't necessarily mean the federal authorities are going to take the case, but they would definitely assist. And then if it was big enough, and they felt it beneficial to take it to the federal or higher up in the state level, they would do that. But I don't think there's anything stopping local departments. I do think there's a lack of knowledge in the crypto arena in a lot of local departments. For some people just aren't interested in it, and some aren't just getting enough activity to dedicate the resources to it. So I think it all depends on where you are, how aggressive the department is, and if they got a detective who's interested in crypto.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing. One of the things that we were doing when I was with HSI was we're doing constant training on the road. So we had a team from cyber, asset forfeiture, and financial who would travel around to all the states, and they would reach out to departments and say, hey, is there a need for crypto specific training? And the training was more identification, like Richard said, is like, hey, do we even know we're into a crypto investigation? And if so, here's what wallets look like. Here's what artifacts look like if you're on scene, so you know what to look for. And then we would talk about, hey, here's at least the HSI way of seizing those assets and dealing with those assets and dealing with them in an evidentiary capacity. I think that's the biggest thing is like, hey, and we would see this a lot in fentanyl overdose deaths. So state and locals, they tend to be your, you know, your eyes and ears, the true first responders on the ground encountering these types of crimes. And they would get into like a fentanyl overdose death and they would process it like a traditional overdose, but not realize that, hey, the fentanyl was purchased from a dark web vendor via cryptocurrency. So they would just say, hey, we got a fentanyl overdose, process it, boom, 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 and not really know then how do I take the next step and do the analysis to determine who's the vendor he bought it from, how did he pay for it? Can we then trace those transactions back to that vendor and see, can we do attribution on that vendor? We were having a lot of success at the end was tying those specific vendors via the crypto to those fentanyl overdose deaths. So instead of just getting a distribution of narcotics charge, they're actually being charged with an overdose death, which in the US is the Len Bias statute, where they would get substantially higher sentences, up to 15 years, as opposed to, 3-4 years for the drug distribution charge. But without being able to identify what's going on, they're not able to do that. So that's what we were kind of trying to hopefully say, hey, you guys are the eyes and ears out there, the true first responders. Here's what to look for so that you can tie it to the greater investigation.
And then depending on where the funds are going too, right? If the department, like a local department, sees quickly that like it's a Nigerian related scam or something, they're most likely just going to pass that off because they just don't have the bandwidth to spend that much time on trying to trace that all the way back to Nigeria. So they would call the feds and just say, here's what we got. This is more up your speed.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Matt. So I think we're at time here. There are a few more questions, but I wanted to say thank you both for attending and sharing your expertise in crypto. Is there anything else you want to say before we end this?
Thank everybody for coming. And if there's any questions that weren't answered and you want to forward them, through LinkedIn or through Merkle Science, feel free to do so.
No, really same. Thanks for having me. I'm on LinkedIn. If anybody wants to add me and ask any follow-up, I'm always available. Appreciate it.
Thank you both. And thank you everybody who attended. I appreciate it.
Take care.